I sat at the far end of the dining table, wedged between an empty chair and the wall, watching my sister Claire glow under the chandelier like she'd been born to absorb light. My mother stood behind her, hands resting on Claire's shoulders, beaming at the small crowd of relatives gathered in our childhood home in Hartford. The table stretched long and polished, covered in white linen and expensive wine, the kind my mother only brought out when she wanted to impress. I'd driven 3 hours from Boston for this dinner, and no one had asked me about the drive, my job, or whether I was even hungry. Claire raised her glass, laughing at something our uncle said, and I felt that old familiar ache, the one I'd trained myself not to name. Then my mother tapped her fork against crystal, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter. She smiled, the kind of smile that made you lean in, even when you knew better. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice warm and practiced. "Claire is going to be taking over Grandma Margaret's estate. All of it." My stomach dropped. I set my glass down carefully, the stem slippery between my fingers. Around the table, people clapped. Someone whistled. Claire blushed in that practiced way she'd perfected since high school. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to glance my way, to explain, to acknowledge that I was sitting right there. "Se didn't." She just kept smiling, her hand squeezing Claire's shoulder like she was crowning a queen. I didn't know it yet, but in my purse, folded inside a brown envelope I'd picked up that morning from an attorney's office in New Haven, was a document that would drain every ounce of color from their faces. If family ever made you feel invisible in your own story, stay until the end. Because sometimes the people who push you aside forget that silence doesn't mean surrender. Growing up, I learned early that love in our house had a hierarchy. Claire was born 4 minutes after me. But somehow those 4 minutes stretched into a lifetime of distance. She got the canopy bed. I got the hand-me-down futon. She got piano lessons and ballet recitals. I got permission to walk to the library alone because I was responsible. When we were 10, Claire broke Mom's favorite vase, playing indoor soccer. Mom sighed and said accidents happen. When I forgot to take out the trash, I got a lecture about accountability that lasted through dinner. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was the kind of favoritism that lives in the small moments. The way Mom's voice softened when Claire walked into a room. The way Dad's eyes followed her but skipped over me like I was furniture. By middle school, I stopped expecting my parents to show up to my things. Claire had volleyball tournaments, after all, and those mattered. I started working at 15, babysitting for neighbors, then cashiering at a grocery store on weekends. I saved everything. My mother called it admirable. What she meant was convenient. When Claire wanted a car at 16, Dad co-signed a loan. When I asked, he said I should save up and buy my own. "It'll teach you responsibility," he said, like I hadn't been teaching myself that for years. So, primera, dede. I saved for 8 months and bought a rusted Toyota that broke down twice before I graduated high school. Claire got a red convertible with a bow on it for her 18th birthday. I got a card that said, "Proud of you," and a $20 bill inside. By the time we applied to colleges, I'd stopped keeping score. Claire got into a state school with mediocre grades and ASA. Our mom helped her write. My parents paid her tuition in full, bought her a meal plan, and set her up in a dorm with a mini fridge and matching bedding. I got into Boston University on a partial scholarship. When I asked if they could help with the rest, my mother tilted her head and said, "You've always been so independent, Natalie. You'll figure it out. You always do." So, I did. I worked 2 jobs, took out loans, and graduated with honors, while Claire switched majors 3 times and barely scraped by. No one ever asked me how I managed. They just assumed I was built different, like being strong meant I didn't bleed. The only person who ever really saw me was Grandma Margaret. She lived in a pale blue house on the edge of New Haven, the kind with lace curtains and a porch that creaked when you sat on it. The air inside always smelled like vanilla and old books, and when I visited, she'd make me tea in chipped porcelain cups that had belonged to her mother. She never asked why I came alone. She just made space for me. Grandma Margaret had built her life from nothing. She'd started with a single consignment shop in the 70s and turned it into a small chain across Connecticut. By the time I was in high school, she'd sold the business and invested carefully. quietly building a portfolio of rental properties and commercial real estate that no one in the family talked about. She didn't brag. She just worked. When I was 16, struggling to understand a balance sheet for my economics class, she sat beside me at her kitchen table and explained assets and liabilities like they were stories. "Money isn't about having it," she said, tapping the paper with a pen. "It's about knowing what it's worth and who deserves to hold it." I didn't understand what she meant then. I thought she was talking about investments. Now, I know she was talking about people. During my junior year of college, Grandma's health started failing. I visited every weekend I could, sitting beside her while she dozed in her armchair, her breathing shallow and uneven. Claire came once, took a selfie, and posted it with a caption about family. My mother visited when it was convenient, usually with a list of things she thought Grandma should do with her money. Grandma would just smile and say, "We'll see." The last time I saw her awake, she held my hand, her skin papery and cool. "People show you who they are, Natalie," she whispered. "Believe them." 3 weeks later, she was gone. The funeral was small. I cried. Claire checked her phone. My mother wore black and accepted condolences like she was collecting donations. No one mentioned a will. I built my life in Boston, the way I'd built everything else, quietly, carefully, alone. I worked my way up at a mid-sized investment firm, the kind where people noticed competence but didn't celebrate it. I rented a small apartment in Brookline with a window that overlooked a coffee shop. And on weekends, I read financial reports and listened to the rain. I didn't go home often. There was nothing there for me except the same old script. Claire at the center, me at the margins. Everyone pretending it was normal. When I did visit, it was for the obligatory holidays, the kind where you show up, smile, and leave before anyone notices you're unhappy. My mother would hug me briefly and say, "You look thin. Are you eating?" Then she'd turn to Claire and ask about her life for the next 2 hours. Claire had bounced between jobs, boyfriends, and apartments, and every time something fell apart, my parents caught her. When she couldn't make rent, they paid it. When she wrecked her car, they bought her another. When she decided to start a lifestyle blog that never took off, Te Fondé Italiano, and every time my mother would call me and say, "Your sister's going through a hard time. Could you lend her a little something, just until she gets back on her feet?" I lent. I never got it back. But I stopped asking, because asking meant admitting I cared, and I'd worked too hard to stop caring. Then, 6 months after Grandma Margaret died, the call came. My mother's voice was bright, almost giddy. "Natalie, sweetheart, we're having a special dinner for Claire this weekend. You should come." "It's important." I hesitated. I had plans, a quiet Saturday of reading and avoiding my inbox. But something in her tone made me curious. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "You'll see," she said. "Just come. It'll mean a lot to the family." The family. Not to me. To the family. I said I'd be there. I drove down on Saturday afternoon, the highway stretching gray and wet under October clouds. My hands tightened on the wheel every time I thought about turning around. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe this time would be different. When I pulled up to the house, the driveway was full, my uncle's truck, my mother's sedan, a few cars I didn't recognize. The front door was unlocked, and I stepped inside to the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. The dining room had been transformed. The table was set with the good china, the kind my mother only used for Thanksgiving. Candles flickered in silver holders. A bouquet of white roses sat in the center, and the smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. Claire stood near the head of the table, wearing a cream dress and a smile that looked rehearsed. My mother hovered beside her, radiant. I set my purse on the side table and waited for someone to greet me. My uncle waved. A cousin I barely knew nodded. My mother glanced at me briefly and said, "Oh, Natalie, you made it. Sit anywhere." Anywhere. I found a seat at the far end of the table, tucked between an empty chair and the wall. From there, I could see everything, but no one could see me. Dinner began. Plates were passed. Wine was poured. My mother stood and raised her glass, her voice ringing clear. "To Claire," she said, "for everything she's about to accomplish." I looked at Claire, who blushed and looked down modestly. I looked at my mother, who didn't look at me, and I felt that old familiar hollow, the one I'd spent my whole life trying to fill. Then my mother cleared her throat, and the room quieted. As many of you know, she began, my mother, Margaret, left behind a significant estate, properties, investments, things she built over a lifetime. She paused for effect, smiling at Claire. After a lot of thought, we've decided that Claire will be taking over the management of everything. She's ready for it. She deserves it. The room erupted in applause. Someone clapped Claire on the back. My uncle raised his glass and said, "That's wonderful. Margaret would be proud." I sat frozen, the words echoing in my head like something far away. I looked at my mother. "What estate?" I asked quietly. She glanced at me, her smile tightening. Mom's rental properties, the commercial building in New Haven, her investment accounts. We've been handling it since she passed. We? My voice stayed calm, but my chest was tightening. You and Claire? Well, yes, my mother said, as if it were obvious. Claire needs the stability. You've always been so independent, Natalie. You don't need help. You've made that very clear. Across the table, Claire looked at me, her expression somewhere between pity and triumph. Grandma probably didn't even think about you, Nat, she said softly. You barely visited her. The words hit like a slap. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My mother turned away, raising her glass again. 2 new beginnings, she said. I didn't drink. I didn't speak. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing down on my shoulders. But something else stirred beneath it, something cold and sharp. I excused myself quietly, slipping out to the hallway. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection, my face pale under the yellow light. On the wall hung an old photo of Grandma Margaret, smiling in front of her first shop. I thought about her voice, her hands, the way she'd looked at me during our last conversation. People show you who they are. Believe them. I pulled out my phone and searched for the name I'd seen on Grandma's Christmas cards for years. Peterson and Associates, attorneys at law, New Haven. I called. A receptionist answered. I need to speak to Mr. Peterson, I said. It's about the estate of Margaret Holloway. The next morning, I sat in a leather chair across from Mr. Peterson, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and a manila folder in front of him. His office smelled like old paper and coffee. Miss Holloway, he said, I'm glad you called. I was actually planning to reach out to you. I frowned. Why? He opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. Because you're the sole beneficiary of your grandmother's estate. I stared at the paper, my name, typed in black ink. Natalie Ann Holloway. Sole heir. That's not possible, I said. My mother said Claire was taking over everything. Mr. Peterson's expression didn't change. Your mother has no legal authority over your grandmother's estate. This will was executed 4 years ago and updated 6 months before Mrs. Holloway passed. Everything goes to you. My hands trembled as I picked up the document. The words blurred, then sharpened. Property deeds. Investment accounts. A commercial building. Estimated value, over $1.2 million. Why, me, Primera? Whispered. He reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope. My name written on it in Grandma's shaky handwriting. She left this for you. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. Her words slanting across the paper. Natalie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you've finally learned the truth. I watched them push you aside your whole life. I watched you work for everything while your sister was handed everything. I watched you become strong not because you wanted to, but because you had to. You earned this, not because you're my granddaughter, but because you're the only one who understood what it means to build something. Don't let them take it. Don't let them make you small. You were never small. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to be. Love, Grandma. I read it twice, my throat tight. Mr. Peterson waited. Your mother never had control of the estate, sighed Hentley. She may have assumed, But legally, everything transferred to you upon your grandmother's death. If she's been representing herself as the estate manager, that's a problem. I looked up. What do I do? He leaned back. You take what's yours. I drove back to Boston in silence. The will and the letter sitting on the passenger seat, like passengers I wasn't ready to talk to. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the dinner, every smug smile, every dismissive glance. They thought they'd won. They thought Grandma had forgotten me, but she hadn't. She'd seen everything. For the next 3 days, I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Claire. I went to work. I filed papers. I stayed quiet. But at night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through everything Mr. Peterson had given me. Deeds to 3 rental properties in New Haven. Statements from investment accounts. A commercial lease agreement for a building that housed 2 businesses. My grandmother hadn't just left me money, she'd left me a foundation. On Wednesday, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice light. Natalie, hi, did you think about what we talked about at dinner? I did, I said evenly. Actually, I wanted to ask you something. You said Claire is managing Grandma's estate? Yes, that's right. What paperwork did you file to make that official? There was a pause. Well, we haven't filed anything yet. We're working with a lawyer. Which lawyer? Another pause. Longer this time. Why, are you asking? Because I spoke to Grandma's actual lawyer yesterday, and he told me something interesting. Silence. I kept my voice calm. He told me I'm the sole heir. Everything goes to me. So I'm wondering what paperwork you think you're filing. I heard her breath catch. That's not possible. It's very possible. I have the will. It's dated and notarized. Natalie, your grandmother wasn't in her right mind. She was, I interrupted. I have letters, medical records, everything. She knew exactly what she was doing. My mother's voice turned sharp. You can't just swoop in and take everything. This is a family matter. You're right, I said. It is. And Grandma decided who she trusted. It wasn't you. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but my chest felt light. Connecticut is a one-party consent state. I'd recorded everything. That weekend, I drove back to Hartford. This time, I wasn't going to sit quietly at the end of the table. I texted my mother that morning. We need to have a family meeting. Today. She replied immediately, Fine a las 3 de la tarde, when I arrived. The house was quiet. My mother sat in the living room, arms crossed. Claire stood by the fireplace, her face pale. My father was there too, looking uncomfortable in the corner. I walked in and set my bag on the coffee table. Thanks for meeting, I said. My mother's voice was tight. What's this about? Natalie. I pulled out my tablet and set it on the table, screen facing them. I want to clear something up. You said Claire is managing Grandma's estate. That's what we decided as a family, my mother said. Except you're not a family decision maker when it comes to Grandma's estate. I am. I tapped the screen. The will appeared, scanned and official. This is Grandma's last will and testament. Executed 4 years ago, updated 6 months before she died. Witnessed, notarized, filed with her attorney. Claire leaned forward, her eyes scanning the text. Her face went white. That can't be real. It's very real, I said. Mr. Peterson confirmed it. I'm the sole beneficiary. Every property, every account, everything. My mother stood, her voice rising. She was confused. She didn't know what she was doing. We were helping her. She wasn't confused, I said, pulling out the letter. She wrote me this. I read it aloud, every word. The room fell silent. When I finished, my mother's hands were trembling. Claire sank into a chair, her face crumpling. You can't do this, my mother whispered. You can't just take everything. I'm not taking anything, I said quietly. I'm accepting what was given to me. What Grandma wanted me to have. Why you? Claire's voice broke. Why not me? I looked at her. Really looked at her. Because I earned it. Not by being the favorite. By being the one who showed up. My mother tried to argue, tried to say Grandma had made a mistake, that we could contest it, that this wasn't fair. But her voice had lost its power. My father, who'd been silent the whole time, finally spoke. Margaret made her choice, he said quietly. We have to respect it. My mother turned on him, but he didn't back down. I gathered my things. Mr. Peterson will be in touch about transferring the properties. If you've been collecting rent or accessing any accounts, that needs to stop immediately. As I walked to the door, my mother called after me. Natalie, please, we're family. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. You're right, we are, and family should have treated me like I mattered. I didn't wait for a response. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the house I'd grown up in, the house where I'd always been the afterthought. Then I started the engine and drove away. 3 weeks later, I stood in the commercial building in New Haven, the one Grandma had owned for 15 years. It was a beautiful old brick structure, with high ceilings and big windows. The tenants, a bookstore and a coffee shop, greeted me warmly when I introduced myself as the new owner. I walked upstairs to the empty office space on the second floor. Sunlight poured through the windows. I set Grandma's photos on the desk, the one from her first shop. For years, I thought being strong meant not needing anyone. I thought independence was the same as isolation. But standing there, in the building my grandmother had built and trusted me to keep, I realized something. Strength isn't about not needing people. It's about being worthy of their trust. I never spoke to my mother or Claire again. They tried calling, texting, showing up, but I'd spent 30 years being invisible to them. Now, it was my turn to disappear. If you've ever been the invisible child who became the chosen one, share your story below. Hit subscribe for more stories where silence becomes power.